The desert of space is full of silence, but silence does not mean emptiness. Across the gulf of millions of miles, Mars has stared back at us like an unfinished story waiting for someone to read its pages. For centuries, telescopes caught only a blur of red dust and shifting light, yet the human imagination painted canals, cities, and civilizations across its surface. In the 20th century, when cameras finally crossed that gulf, they captured not only rocks and shadows, but shapes that stirred a more dangerous thought. What if those stories were not imagination at all? A human face carved into a Martian plain, pyramids aligned as if by the hand of architects who once walked Earth, mysterious grids etched into the ground, and even signs of devastation buried in the soil. These images do not sit quietly. They provoke, they whisper, they force us to ask whether Mars is not just a dead planet, but a graveyard of memory. Was there once a people here, builders and dreamers who reached for permanence against time? And if so, what ended them? This is not simply science. This is the archaeology of wonder, the anthropology of fear. Welcome to historic sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story begins in the summer of 1976, when the Viking 1 orbiter drifted silently above the ruddy skin of Mars, a mechanical eye searching for safe ground. It was a time of immense expectation, because humanity had never before sent machines capable of looking so closely at this distant world. For decades, Mars had existed half in science, half in myth, a planet painted with longing and suspicion. Science fiction had already populated it with canals, dying civilizations, and strange warlike creatures. Now, with each transmission, with each grainy image burned into the memory of orbiting cameras, people hoped for confirmation that the red planet held more than just rocks and dust. And then, amid thousands of pictures, one photograph emerged that would ignite the imagination of millions. Labeled simply as Image 35A72, it showed a region called Cydonia, a desert plain littered with mesas and ridges. At first glance, the terrain looked ordinary, a pattern of shadows stretching across the Martian horizon. But in one frame, a shape arrested the eyes of the scientists in the control room. Rising from the sand, broad as a mountain yet strangely deliberate, was what appeared to be the face of a human. Two hollows sat where eyes should be, a ridge where a nose belonged, a line of shadow forming a mouth. It measured nearly 2 miles across, too massive for a trick of chance to be dismissed easily. The discovery spread through the press with the speed of a spark on dry grass. Newspapers printed the image beside headlines asking whether we had found proof of life. Talk shows speculated about Martian architects. Archaeologists whispered about civilizations erased by time, and ordinary people stared at the photo as if peering into a mirror from another world. NASA responded quickly, perhaps too quickly, insisting it was nothing more than an illusion created by the angle of light. The following day, they even claimed to have another picture of the same site in which the face vanished. But no such image was released, and suspicion grew. Why, people asked, if it was so simple to explain, did the agency move with such haste to cover the story? In the absence of clarity, mystery thickened. The face became a symbol, not just of Mars, but of the tension between official explanation and popular belief. To many, it echoed the long history of human tendency to see meaning where perhaps none existed. Faces in clouds, gods in the stars, omens in the flight of birds. Yet this was different, for the scale was too grand, the outline too sharp. Critics argued that erosion could not so neatly carve symmetry into a hill. Supporters of the natural theory called it pareidolia, the human brain's habit of forcing order upon randomness, shaping rocks into figures. But in the public imagination, that word did little to extinguish the fire. For once, the unknown was not distant, but right in front of us, a geological enigma, carrying human likeness across interplanetary space. Behind the image was a scientist named Toby Owen, who had been tasked with examining photographs to find possible landing sites for Viking 2. His excitement was genuine when he saw the shape. He shared it with colleagues, and soon it was circulating inside NASA itself. But what was intended as a curiosity became, in the hands of the press, something far greater. Suddenly, Cydonia was not just a plain. It was a canvas for speculation. Talk of ancient monuments spread. Writers drew comparisons to the Sphinx in Egypt, arguing that if one civilization on Earth had marked its landscape with stone visages, perhaps another had done the same on Mars. The resemblance was too uncanny to dismiss lightly. Yet the face was not alone. Other structures in the Cydonia region, captured in the same series of images, showed angular forms and shadows that reminded some of pyramids. When grouped together, they resembled not a random scattering of hills, but a deliberate arrangement, like a ruined city square. To those already inclined to believe in ancient builders, this was no coincidence. They saw geometry, planning, intention. One pyramid in particular, later dubbed the D&M Pyramid after the initials of two engineers who studied it, seemed to exhibit five-sided symmetry, rising to a scale far greater than anything in Giza. If this was natural, skeptics argued, it was a marvel of chance more impressive than if it had been designed. The timing of these revelations could not have been more dramatic. The 1970s were marked by public distrust of authority after scandals and wars had frayed faith in institutions. The idea that a government agency might hide or dismiss evidence of extraterrestrial life resonated deeply with a generation already skeptical of official truth. In living rooms and classrooms, in magazines and whispered conversations, the face on Mars became both a wonder and a warning. What else, people asked, are we not being told? As debates unfolded, a cultural split emerged. On one side stood the defenders of scientific caution, urging patience, insisting that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. On the other stood a swelling tide of curiosity, not content to wait for decades of data. For them, the face was not just a formation. It was a message, a monument left behind by a civilization that had vanished but not been forgotten. The photo was their Rosetta Stone, their first glimpse into a history written not in books, but in stone and sand beyond Earth. For scientists trained to separate evidence from desire, this was a troubling turn. They knew how easily the mind could be fooled by perspective and shadow. But they also understood the power of imagery. One picture, taken in orbit millions of miles from home, had become a cultural artifact capable of shaping imagination more strongly than entire libraries of dry data. The face on Mars was no longer just a photo. It was a symbol in the collective psyche, a doorway into possibility. Over the years, the image would be revisited, questioned, enhanced, dismissed, and revived again. But in 1976, in that first moment of discovery, it lived in the liminal space between science and myth. Like a dream half remembered at dawn, it beckoned and eluded in equal measure. And from that moment forward, Mars would never again be seen as just another barren world. It had become a mystery, and mysteries have a way of reshaping not only how we look outward, but how we look at ourselves. Long before the Viking missions ignited public fascination with the face in Cydonia, the story of Mars had already been seeded in the human mind by telescopes pointed at the night sky. In 1877, an Italian astronomer named Giovanni Schiaparelli peered through his lens and saw dark markings crisscrossing the planet's surface. He described them as canali, a word in his own language that meant channels. Yet when translated into English, the word shifted meaning, becoming canals, an altogether different suggestion. Channels could be natural, carved by wind or water, but canals implied construction, purpose, design. And so with a single linguistic slip, the world was set on fire with the idea that Mars was alive with engineers, a society capable of reshaping its landscape. Newspapers printed diagrams of Martian waterways, artists sketched maps of crimson deserts laced with irrigation networks, and the imagination of the late 19th century ran wild with visions of a planet in decline, its people fighting to survive by funneling dwindling water from the poles to the equator. This was an age hungry for mystery, an era when the great blank spaces on Earth were being filled by explorers, and the next frontier had to be the sky. The notion of Martian canals was irresistible. It fit neatly into the stories industrial societies told themselves about progress, about the triumph of engineering over nature. If humanity could dig canals like Suez or Panama, why could not Martians, perhaps older and wiser, carve far greater ones to save their world? Science and fantasy blurred into one, and soon popular writers like Percival Lowell were publishing books claiming detailed networks of Martian canals, entire civilizations visible from Earth if only one looked carefully enough. Skeptics, of course, argued otherwise. They said Schiaparelli's telescope was playing tricks on him, that the eye has a habit of stitching faint lines into imagined structures. Yet the idea would not die. It became part of cultural memory, carried into novels like H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, where Martians became both conquerors and cautionary figures. By the time the 20th century arrived, Mars was no longer just a star in the sky. It was a mirror reflecting human hopes and fears. But as technology advanced, so too did disappointment. In 1965, NASA's Mariner 4 spacecraft became the first to fly past Mars, sending back 22 photographs. What they revealed was a landscape barren and cratered, more like the moon than a world of canals and cities. The dream dimmed. The canals vanished. To many scientists, the case was closed. Mars was a dry husk, lifeless and lonely. Yet even in that stark silence, some were not ready to surrender. The possibility lingered that the probe had simply passed over the wrong regions, missing signs of something more. The mystery hung in the balance, waiting for another chance. That chance came a decade later, when Viking 1 took its fateful images. Unlike Mariner, Viking carried more sophisticated instruments, capable not only of orbiting, but of sending landers down to the surface. Its mission was ambitious: to search directly for life, to study soil chemistry, and to give humanity its first close look at the Martian ground. But when the face appeared in its photographs, a strange reversal occurred. Instead of scientists fueling speculation and the public demanding caution, it was the opposite. The public embraced the enigma while NASA tried to rein it in. The canals of Schiaparelli's time had been dismissed by better optics. The face now threatened to be dismissed by official reassurance. Yet just as the mistranslation of canali had shaped a century of imagination, the shadow of the face shaped a new one. The psychological pull was undeniable. A face is the first pattern a human being recognizes, the one our minds are wired to seek. From infancy, we lock onto eyes and mouths, finding comfort or fear in their expressions. To see such a pattern carved into the surface of another world was to feel contact, even if only with our own reflection. Skeptics argued this was precisely the trap, that our brains, tuned by evolution to find faces, were finding them where none existed. But to millions, that explanation felt too thin, too dismissive of a phenomenon that carried weight and symmetry. And then there were the pyramids. Around the same region of Cydonia, other formations rose from the desert plain. They looked angular, geometric, positioned as though in a cluster. To some, they resembled the pyramids of Egypt or Mexico, ancient markers of human ambition. The resemblance was enough to launch entire fields of speculation. What if these were remnants of a Martian civilization, the ruins of a city now buried by time? What if the builders of Earth's monuments had shared ancestry with Martians, or had even been guided by them? Such thoughts were intoxicating, too powerful to be dismissed as coincidence. Within NASA, the official narrative was cautious, often defensive. When asked, spokespeople described the formations as mesas and buttes, natural erosion sculpted by wind and dust storms across millions of years. But the more they insisted, the more suspicion grew. People remembered Schiaparelli, remembered Lowell, remembered the long line of visions discounted by authority. Each denial seemed to sharpen the hunger for an alternative. Conspiracy entered the conversation. Perhaps the government knew more than it admitted. Perhaps the pictures being shown to the public were not the best ones. Perhaps Mars was not lifeless at all, but a graveyard of civilizations that someone wanted to keep hidden. In this way, Mars became less a planet than a stage, upon which humanity rehearsed its deepest questions. Are we alone? Have others walked before us, building in stone and symmetry? If they vanished, what destroyed them, and could the same fate await us? The face and the pyramids were not merely geological debates, they were existential mirrors. And in the late 1970s, with distrust in institutions at a peak, they became cultural symbols as potent as any political scandal or war. Cydonia, once just a dusty Martian plain, was now a theater of human imagination. From astronomers peering through 19th-century telescopes to spacecraft circling in the vacuum, the narrative had never been linear. It swung between belief and doubt, between wonder and disillusionment. Each discovery erased one myth and wrote another. The face on Mars was only the latest, but it was not the end. For in the years to come, other eyes would return to that red desert, and each time they did, the mystery deepened. The photograph of the face might have remained a curiosity, a passing image in a catalogue of Martian landscapes, if not for what happened next. In the wake of its release, NASA scrambled to cool the fever. Within 24 hours, a project scientist for the Viking mission, Gerald Soffen, stood before reporters and delivered what seemed like a rehearsed line. Isn't it peculiar what tricks of light and shadow can do? When we took another picture a few hours later, it all went away. The statement was simple, almost casual, but it carried a weight of finality. With it, the face was reclassified not as evidence, not as mystery, but as illusion. Yet the second image he spoke of was never shown to the public. There were no side-by-side comparisons, no transparent evidence that the feature was merely a product of sunlight. Instead, the face was brushed aside, a problem managed with words rather than proof. And in that absence, suspicion grew roots. If the explanation was so simple, why was the evidence withheld? It was in this gap between statement and silence that independent researchers began to move. Men and women who had no direct access to the spacecraft, but who pored over publicly released images, started to notice things NASA seemed eager to ignore. Around the face, they found other anomalies: rectangular mounds, triangular ridges, even clusters of hills that looked eerily like pyramids arranged with purpose. The more closely they looked, the less random Cydonia appeared. What if the face was not alone? What if it was part of a larger landscape of design? Among those who took the matter seriously were two engineers, Vincent de Pietro and Gregory Molinaire. Both had experience in imaging systems, the kind of technical background that made them comfortable with satellite photographs. As they studied the Viking images, one structure leapt out, a massive, five-sided formation that would come to be called the D&M Pyramid. It dwarfed even the largest pyramid in Egypt, rising nearly 1.5 miles high, with symmetry that seemed too precise to be explained by random geology. Unlike most natural formations, which crumble into irregular shapes, this one displayed bilateral symmetry and angles suggestive of deliberate construction. To the engineers, the odds of chance felt thin. Their work drew in another figure, Errol Torin, a professional satellite imagery analyst who had spent his career distinguishing between natural and artificial features from orbit. When he examined the D&M pyramid, his conclusion startled even himself. He found no geological mechanism that could plausibly explain its geometry. The structure, he wrote, exhibited ratios and symmetries unseen in ordinary landforms. To him, the evidence leaned toward artificiality. It was a conclusion few in the scientific establishment dared to voice, but Torun placed his name on it. And still, NASA stood by its dismissal. The formations were mesas, they said, eroded by dust storms over countless ages. Any suggestion otherwise was imagination, nothing more. But in the wider world, people remembered the secrecy around the second photograph. They remembered the quickness with which the face had been labeled illusion. Trust eroded faster than the Martian mesas themselves. For if the D&M pyramid really did reflect advanced geometry, ratios tied to mathematical constants like pi and phi, the same numbers encoded in Earth's monuments, then the implications were staggering. It would mean a common language of design, a bridge between worlds. Dr. Mark Carlotto, an expert in remote sensing and image processing, joined the conversation. His analysis, along with that of Richard Hoagland, a former NASA consultant, added further weight. They argued that the structures in Cydonia aligned with geometric precision not found in natural erosion. The clustering of pyramids mirrored arrangements seen at Giza and Teotihuacan. To them, Cydonia looked less like a desert plain and more like a ruined city square. The resonance was unsettling. It suggested continuity between Earth and Mars, as though the same hand or the same tradition had touched both. The debate moved beyond science into culture, seeping into late-night radio shows, magazine features, and eventually television specials. Ordinary people, who might otherwise have glanced past space news, found themselves staring at photographs of another world and wondering if human history was larger than they had been told. For many, the face was not just rock. It was an invitation to reimagine our place in the cosmos. And the pyramids beside it were monuments, silent but eloquent, whispering of a time when Mars might have thrived. NASA's denials, far from settling the matter, hardened the sense of cover-up. Each time officials brushed aside questions, new theories bloomed. Perhaps the government feared the social upheaval of admitting we were not alone. Perhaps the structures were evidence of a shared past, one that would rewrite every history book. Or perhaps, darker still, there were current interests on Mars, missions and secrets not shared with the public. In the fertile ground of suspicion, speculation grew tall. Meanwhile, researchers kept digging. They scrutinized shadow lengths, measured angles, tested ratios. They argued that the formations echoed not randomness, but intention, a design shaped by intelligence. Hoagland even proposed that the layout of the Cydonia complex encoded a message, a mathematical fingerprint left by its builders. The more intricate the theories became, the more they captured the imagination of those willing to believe. For skeptics, this was troubling. Science relies on evidence, and extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. To them, the photographs were low resolution, the shadows deceptive, the interpretations fanciful. But the photographs were all the public had, and in the ambiguity of grainy images, belief found room to breathe. Every blurred edge became a doorway for wonder. And so the Cydonia debate took on a life of its own. It was no longer just about geology or imaging techniques. It was about trust, secrecy, and the hunger for connection beyond Earth. The face was a mask in more ways than one, concealing whatever truth lay beneath, while revealing humanity's own longing for meaning in the cosmos. In that sense, the controversy was inevitable. From the mistranslation of canali to the canals of Lowell, from mariners' barren photographs to Vikings' enigmatic ones, Mars had always been less a planet than a screen. Onto it, we projected both fear and hope, skepticism and belief. The face in Cydonia was simply the latest projection, but it carried a power that no official statement could erase. And as the years passed, as new missions were planned and old images re-examined, one thing became clear. The mystery of Mars was not going to fade. It had been carved too deeply, not only into the surface of a distant planet, but into the imagination of those who stared at it from Earth. The pyramids of Cydonia were never meant to be quiet. Even in photographs stripped of color, reduced to grayscale pixels transmitted across millions of miles, they spoke with the weight of form. The cluster was soon given a name that carried its own power: the City Square. It was not a random field of hills. To the eyes of researchers studying the images frame by frame, it looked like a gathering, an arrangement with symmetry that reached beyond accident. Some pyramids stood tall and distinct, while others appeared broken, collapsed, or half buried in sand. Among them, one formation drew attention more than the rest: the fortress, a structure that seemed wounded, as if it had once stood whole but had fallen in on itself. To believers, it was a ruin, the echo of catastrophe. To skeptics, it was simply erosion, but the very act of naming these features, fortress, city square, imprinted them with personality, drawing them out of the anonymous Martian dust and into the realm of story. Near the fortress rose the most enigmatic of all, the D&M Pyramid. Where natural mesas crumble into irregular outlines, this one displayed 5 sides, sharp and deliberate, aligned in a way that suggested purpose. At more than a mile in height and several miles in breadth, it dwarfed even Earth's greatest monuments. If the Great Pyramid of Giza was already a marvel of human ambition, the D&M Pyramid was something else entirely. A giant that seemed almost impossible. The engineers Di Pietro and Molinar, who had identified it, could not dismiss its proportions as accident. To them, the structure carried geometry, an order that spoke a language of mathematics rather than chaos. When Errol Torun, the imagery analyst, subjected the D&M Pyramid to careful measurement, his findings deepened the riddle. The angles matched constants revered in both nature and architecture, phi, the golden ratio, and pi, the circle's eternal companion. These numbers did not appear by chance. They were principles, echoes of design. Torun concluded that the natural hypothesis lacked any mechanism capable of explaining the formation. To him, it bore the unmistakable fingerprint of construction. In making that claim, he crossed a line few scientists dared approach, and in doing so, he became part of a growing chorus that challenged NASA's dismissals. For Richard Hoagland, the former NASA consultant, and Mark Carlotto, the remote sensing specialist, the pyramids were part of a grander vision. They argued that the city square was not just an arrangement of rocks, but a deliberate map, a layout encoding mathematical relationships. When placed against the pyramids of Earth, similarities emerged not just in form, but in alignment. At Giza, the pyramids followed celestial patterns, aligning with Orion's belt. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, temples mirrored the path of the Milky Way. If Earth's ancient builders had tied their monuments to the heavens, why not Mars? To Hoagland and Carlotto, Cydonia appeared as another node in a cosmic tradition, a bridge of stone linking planets across space and time. The suggestion was staggering, that Mars had once hosted a civilization advanced enough to build on a monumental scale, leaving behind structures that mirrored those on Earth. If true, it raised questions that cut to the core of human identity. Were the builders related to us? Did they share a common ancestor? Or had they once visited Earth and seeded their knowledge among early humans? The pyramids of Cydonia seemed to invite such speculation, standing like mute ambassadors from a forgotten age. NASA's stance remained unchanged. To their geologists, the formations were mesas shaped by erosion, nothing more. But erosion does not so neatly carve pentagons, nor does it align monuments in city-like grids. The agency's insistence, repeated without new evidence, only fueled suspicion. When independent researchers published their findings, showing ratios and alignments too precise to ignore, NASA responded with silence. And silence, in the theater of mystery, is louder than words. The debate spilled out of laboratories and into living rooms. Late-night radio carried the voices of enthusiasts who believed Mars had once been alive with cities and people. Documentaries replayed the images, tracing outlines with narration heavy with wonder. Books filled shelves, proposing theories that ranged from lost Martian empires to alien visitors shaping both Mars and Earth. The city square became more than a photograph. It became a symbol of the unknown, a landscape of possibility etched in red sand. And yet, in the shadow of these claims, skeptics raised their own alarms. Low-resolution images, they argued, invite the eye to see what it wishes to see. The human brain is a pattern machine, skilled at turning noise into meaning. Clouds into castles, shadows into faces, mesas into pyramids. But even they could not entirely explain away the persistence of geometric order. Chance, after all, has its limits. The city square stood as a battleground between caution and belief. For every scientist urging restraint, there was a researcher pointing to angles that whispered of design. For every voice calling the pyramids mesas, there was another calling them monuments. The tension revealed more than just a disagreement about geology. It revealed humanity's hunger for connection, for proof that intelligence is not confined to Earth. The pyramids of Cydonia were mirrors in which we saw our own desire to endure, to leave behind structures that defy time. As the years passed, the debate only deepened. Some treated the pyramids as myth, dismissing them as one more fantasy in a long line of cosmic illusions. Others treated them as sacred clues, fragments of a larger story waiting to be uncovered. In either case, the pyramids had already succeeded in reshaping the way Mars was imagined. No longer just a dry world of dust and rock, it was a place where civilization might once have stood, where monuments still watched silently beneath the sweep of alien skies. And in that silence, one question lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. If Mars truly held a civilization capable of such grandeur, what happened to it? The pyramids stood not only as evidence but as tombstones, marking the possibility of a people who reached for permanence and fell into ruin. Whether natural or artificial, they forced us to imagine the fragility of our own world and the ease with which cities can turn to sand. By the late 1980s, the face and the pyramids of Cydonia had become more than curiosities. They were controversies. For every article that dismissed them as geological accidents, another appeared insisting on design. The tug-of-war between skepticism and belief gained a new stage in the 1990s when pressure on NASA mounted to revisit the mysterious region with better cameras. If the formations were indeed tricks of light, as officials had claimed, then higher-resolution photographs should have put the matter to rest. Instead, what followed only thickened the fog. In 1996, a mission was launched to provide the clarity people had long demanded. The Mars Observer was expected to capture detailed images of Cydonia, images sharp enough to silence speculation or confirm it once and for all. But before the probe could fulfill its task, NASA announced that it had vanished. Contact was lost. The news was delivered with a shrug of inevitability, as if spacecraft simply disappear. For those already suspicious, the failure was not an accident, but a convenient erasure. How, they asked, could the very mission designed to end debate vanish just as it approached the most controversial terrain? The disappearance of the observer became another layer in the mystery, another absence speaking louder than presence. 2 years later, in 1998, NASA tried again. This time they released images claimed to be the long-awaited close-ups of the face. But rather than clarity, the photographs seemed clouded, blurred, their resolution oddly disappointing for an era of advancing technology. Far from silencing speculation, the new images ignited it. Researchers and enthusiasts alike dubbed them the catbox photographs because the face now resembled nothing more than a smudge scratched into sand by a restless animal. To critics, the images looked manipulated, deliberately degraded. How could technology that had captured detailed shots of distant moons now fail to deliver a clear view of Mars? The suspicion deepened. Perhaps NASA did not want the public to see the truth. Perhaps the images had been filtered, altered, stripped of detail to reduce them to ambiguity. The frustration was palpable. For decades, people had waited for answers, only to receive photographs that seemed worse than the originals. Rather than quell the fascination, the so-called catbox fed it. The very attempt to close the case reopened it with renewed force. In living rooms across the world, viewers compared the 1976 image with the 1998 version and asked themselves which looked more authentic. Many concluded that the older one, though grainy, carried more detail, more shape, more humanity. And so the debate, far from ending, entered a new chapter, one marked by mistrust, not only of explanations but of the evidence itself. NASA's defenders argued that lighting conditions, atmospheric haze, and the limitations of the instruments explained the disappointing results. But those explanations rang hollow to a public already weary of contradiction. From "it's just a shadow" to "we lost the spacecraft" to "the images are poor because of bad weather on Mars," the narrative seemed to shift with each new demand for clarity. It was not just the face or the pyramids that were in question now. It was credibility. When institutions change their story, belief begins to migrate elsewhere. And migrate it did. Independent researchers doubled their efforts. Hoagland, Carlotto, and others examined the catbox photos with the same determination they had given the originals, insisting that even within the blur, evidence of symmetry remained. Some claimed to detect eyes, a nose, even teeth. Others pointed to subtle outlines of the pyramids, still aligned in patterns too precise to dismiss. For them, the blurring itself became part of the evidence, not a failure of cameras, but an act of concealment. The idea of a cover-up took on momentum, not as wild speculation, but as a natural response to repeated disappointment. By this point, the face and the pyramids were no longer simply geological debates. They had become cultural touchstones. Radio hosts spoke of them as symbols of hidden truth. Documentaries presented them as mysteries that the establishment feared. To many, the controversy echoed older patterns in history: the suppression of inconvenient discoveries, the rewriting of narratives to protect orthodoxy. Whether or not the structures on Mars were artificial, they had revealed something artificial here on Earth: the delicate dance between what is shown and what is withheld. The timing of the catbox only amplified the resonance. The late 1990s were an age of rising digital technology, an age when information flowed faster than ever, but also when skepticism of authority was growing sharper. Conspiracies found fertile soil, and the face on Mars became one of their most compelling seeds. Even those who doubted alien civilizations could not help but wonder why the images looked so contrived, why the agency tasked with exploration seemed reluctant to explore. Suspicion fed on silence, and silence grew thicker. The irony was that the very act of dismissal gave the mystery longevity. Had NASA been transparent from the beginning, had it released all images openly and allowed debate to unfold naturally, perhaps the face and the pyramids would have faded into obscurity. Instead, Each denial without evidence became fuel. Each missing photograph became a whisper of secrets. By trying to control the narrative, they had made it uncontainable. Cydonia had slipped beyond geology and entered mythology. And yet, beneath the layers of controversy, the core question remained unresolved. What are these formations? Natural mesas sculpted by aeons of wind, or the silent ruins of a civilization long vanished? Each photograph, whether clear or blurred, invited the same haunting thought: that somewhere beneath the dust, stone might still remember the hands that shaped it. And if that were true, then Mars was not only a dead world, but a world with a history. A world that once carried memory in the form of architecture. The catbox images, rather than erasing the face, had ensured its immortality. They preserved it as a riddle, not to be solved by a single photograph, but to be wrestled with by generations. For in the end, mysteries thrive not on answers, but on the space left by their absence. The face endured, not because it was proven real, but because it was never proven false. And so it waited, carved into the red desert, a mask gazing up from another world, daring us to look back and question not only what we see, but what we are told to see. The story of Cydonia might have cooled after the catbox controversy, resigned to the limbo of unresolved anomalies, if not for what came next. In the late 1990s, as researchers dug back into the Viking archives, they stumbled upon something NASA itself had either misplaced or deliberately buried. Among the reels of data was another image of the face, one that had not been included in official statements, one that contradicted the narrative of trick shadows and illusions. This photograph revealed more than the first. The left side of the formation, which in the original image had been obscured in shadow, now appeared more clearly lit. The details were startling. Not only were the hollows of eyes visible, but one socket showed a distinct dark spot within it, like a pupil. The ridge of the nose appeared sharper, and the mouth displayed an outline suggestive of teeth. These were not the vague lines of rock softened by erosion. They were features, symmetrical, deliberate, persuasive. The discovery rippled outward, breathing new life into the debate. Independent analysts examined the image pixel by pixel, measuring parallel lines and curved edges. To their eyes, the structure no longer looked like a chance trick. It looked more like a sculpture, something carved with intention. The presence of a pupil in the eye socket was particularly damning for the illusion theory. Nature rarely produces hollows within hollows, curves within curves, all arranged in symmetry across a massive scale. And yet here, in the Martian desert, such a pattern seemed undeniable. For the D&M team, DiPietro, Moliner, Hoagland, and Carlotto, the misfiled image was a vindication. It suggested that NASA had known more than it admitted. Why else would such a crucial photograph remain hidden in the archive, filed away under an innocuous label? To them, the concealment was as telling as the image itself. If the face truly were illusion, there would have been no need to hide alternate views. Transparency would have served NASA's case. Instead, secrecy had deepened suspicion, and the new photograph became a rallying cry for those who believed the truth of Cydonia was being smothered. Analysis grew bolder. Hoagland argued that the face, when combined with the pyramids and other formations, displayed a network of alignments encoded with mathematical constants. Ratios of pi and phi appeared again, not only in the D&M pyramid, but in the spacing between the structures. Carlotto added that the second image of the face showed bilateral symmetry over hundreds of yards, something geological forces did not ordinarily produce. To them, this was not coincidence, but communication, a message written in stone for anyone advanced enough to read it. NASA, once more, responded with dismissal. The agency insisted that shadows and low-resolution imagery explained the patterns, but the denials had lost their weight. By now, the public had watched a pattern of contradiction play out too many times. First, the face was illusion. Then, another picture proved it was gone. That picture never appeared. Then, the Mars observer disappeared. Then, the catbox arrived. And now, a misfiled image revealed more detail than ever. Each step felt less like science and more like theater, a play where the script was always designed to downplay the extraordinary. The idea of concealment resonated beyond astronomy. It tapped into the broader climate of suspicion in the late 20th century, when trust in institutions had eroded under the weight of scandals and secrets. From politics to war to science, the notion that truth was managed rather than revealed felt painfully familiar. And so the face on Mars became more than a question of geology. It became a symbol of hidden knowledge, of the possibility that humanity was being shielded from a history too unsettling to confront. In the details of the second image, researchers claimed to see more than features. Some pointed out a stripe pattern along the sides of the face, as if decoration or texture had been carved into stone. Others described contours resembling a headdress, echoing the Sphinx of Giza. The comparisons grew increasingly elaborate, but at their heart was a simple intuition. This did not look natural. It looked like art. Monumental art, perhaps eroded and weathered across eons, but art nonetheless. The stakes of such a claim were enormous. If the face and the pyramids were artificial, then Mars was not only once alive, but once civilized. That would mean human history was incomplete, our narrative provincial. Civilization would not be unique to Earth, but a cosmic phenomenon, rising and falling across worlds. The ruins of Cydonia would then stand as a warning as well as a revelation, reminding us that even the greatest monuments cannot guarantee survival. Yet the mystery remained suspended. The misfiled image had surfaced, but it was still a photograph, still subject to interpretation. For believers, it was proof. For skeptics, it was artifact of light and shadow, enhanced by imagination. The two sides stared at the same pixels and saw different worlds. One saw erosion, the other saw design. The gulf between them mirrored the gulf between Earth and Mars, vast, silent, unbridgeable. Still, the story refused to fade. Late-night radio shows broadcast the latest findings with breathless excitement. Magazines published side-by-side comparisons of the face, daring readers to deny the features that stared back. Public fascination surged, and with it came pressure on NASA to produce better evidence, to return with clarity instead of excuses. The call was simple. Show us the truth. But truth, when bound to mystery, is rarely simple. Even if clearer images arrived, would they silence speculation? Or would new details only deepen the riddle? For mysteries of this scale are not solved by evidence alone. They live in the space between imagination and doubt, between what we are told and what we believe. And the face, with its eyes, its mouth, its improbable symmetry, lived most vividly in that space. On the Martian plain, the face endured. Sandstorms swept across its features. Seasons passed, decades turned, and still it stared skyward, inscrutable as ever. On Earth, the debates swirled endlessly. To some it was a monument, to others a mesa. But to everyone who saw it, in photographs old or new, it was a question carved in stone, a question that had no intention of answering itself. By the time the second Viking image surfaced, the debate had grown too large to be contained in academic journals or technical reports. It spilled into popular culture, riding the airwaves of late-night radio, a place where mystery thrived. Among the most influential voices was Richard Hoagland, who understood that the story of Cydonia was not only a scientific question, but a cultural drama. He carried the case to the microphones of Coast to Coast AM, a program that reached millions of listeners across America, a show that specialized in the strange and the unexplainable. On those airwaves, freed from the caution of formal science, Hoagland spoke of the face and the pyramids with the urgency of revelation. He described alignments, ratios, and symmetries, drawing listeners into a vision of Mars as once alive, once intelligent, once connected to Earth itself. To many, his words did not sound like speculation, but like archaeology, the unveiling of a history denied. The effect was electric. Phone lines lit up with callers who spoke of their own belief that humanity was not alone. Some claimed to see messages hidden in the photographs. Others spoke of dreams and visions linking Mars to ancient civilizations. The face became more than an image. It became a collective canvas, a place onto which millions projected their yearning for meaning. In living rooms, truck cabs, and midnight kitchens, the question of Cydonia turned into a kind of folklore, woven into the late 20th century as firmly as any ghost story or urban legend. NASA, meanwhile, bristled at the growing attention. For an agency rooted in engineering and data, being forced into the arena of conspiracy felt both humiliating and threatening. Yet their responses only deepened the rift. Each time they dismissed the claims, without offering transparent evidence, they fueled suspicion. The silence around the supposed second photo, the disappearance of the Mars observer, the blurring of the catbox, all of it formed a pattern too neat for skeptics to ignore. To many, it looked less like incompetence and more like choreography, a slow dance of concealment. In this climate, even the smallest anomaly could ignite firestorms of speculation. When an image appeared to show a rectangular opening in a Martian rock face, some called it a doorway. When another revealed long linear ridges that crossed like highways, researchers dubbed them glass tunnels, the ruins of a transport system. A dome-shaped collapse became, in some minds, the remnant of an ancient shelter. Every photograph seemed pregnant with possibility, and every denial seemed hollow. Mars, once seen as barren, now appeared crowded with ghosts of civilization. Hoagland and others argued that the public was witnessing the slow unveiling of a cover-up, a struggle between those who sought to reveal the truth and those who feared its consequences. If Mars had once hosted a civilization, the implications would stretch far beyond astronomy. Religion, history, politics, identity, all would be forced to reckon with the fact that intelligence had thrived elsewhere, long before or long apart from us. To some, the thought was exhilarating. To others, it was destabilizing. Either way, it explained why institutions might prefer silence. As the debate raged, the face itself became iconic. It appeared on book covers, magazine spreads, and television specials. It entered pop culture, referenced in movies and cartoons, a shorthand for the idea that something out there is being hidden from us. In the same way that Roswell had come to symbolize secrecy around extraterrestrials, Cydonia became a symbol of the hidden history of Mars. Even skeptics, while rejecting the claims of artificiality, admitted that the cultural power of the image was undeniable. It had crossed from science into myth, and myths, once born, are not easily buried. This cultural rise coincided with another shift: the Internet. In the mid-1990s, as online forums and early websites blossomed, enthusiasts shared high-resolution scans of the Viking photographs, analyzed pixels, and debated theories in real time. Suddenly, independent researchers were no longer isolated voices, but a community, global and relentless. Images of the face circulated not through official channels, but through digital backdoors, passed from one amateur analyst to another, each one adding interpretations, diagrams, and arguments. The democratization of information made it harder than ever for NASA to control the narrative. The more they downplayed the face, the louder the chorus grew outside their walls. For the broader public, the controversy illuminated something deeper than the question of Martian monuments. It exposed the fragile line between science and storytelling, between data and the human hunger for meaning. The face was both rock and sculpture, both illusion and revelation, depending on who looked and how. That ambiguity gave it life. Had the image been unquestionably clear, either a perfect natural mesa or a perfect carved statue, the mystery might have collapsed. But its grainy quality, its refusal to yield certainty, kept it alive in the imagination. It was the in-between state that gave it power. Hoagland knew this. He presented the mystery not as a solved puzzle, but as an unfolding one, a narrative in which every listener could participate. He invited people to measure, to speculate, to join the search. In doing so, he transformed the face from a NASA photograph into a shared cultural project. Whether believer or skeptic, people were drawn into the story, compelled by the possibility that somewhere, on a cold desert world, history had been written in stone and left for us to find. The more attention the face received, the more it bled into broader theories. Some suggested that if advanced builders had once thrived on Mars, perhaps they had visited Earth as well. The similarities between Martian pyramids and those of Egypt or Mexico became evidence of a shared origin, a cosmic heritage binding civilizations across planets. To skeptics, this was fantasy. But to believers, it was a revelation waiting to be acknowledged. Mars was no longer just another planet. It was family. By the close of the decade, the face on Mars had secured its place as one of the great enigmas of modern imagination. It was no longer just a question of science, but of trust, culture, and the human longing for connection. It stood as both a symbol of what might be hidden beyond our world and of the deep desire to find ourselves reflected in the universe. And through it all, the face remained, watching from Cydonia, as silent as ever, yet louder in our minds than perhaps any image ever taken of the red planet. The fascination with Cydonia did not remain confined to the face and the pyramids. As new missions scanned wider portions of the Martian surface, other anomalies began to emerge, each one a spark thrown onto a landscape already dry with speculation. In 2002, NASA's Mars Global Surveyor captured an image of something startling in the southern hemisphere, near a region called Lucus Planum. Instead of mesas or craters, the photograph revealed a sprawling lattice of crisscrossing lines stretching across the desert like the ghostly blueprint of a city. Rectangular blocks appeared stacked in geometric order, angles converging with eerie precision. To the eyes of ordinary viewers, it resembled nothing so much as the grid of a planned settlement. Almost instantly, it acquired a nickname: the Inca City. The comparison was not accidental. Scholars and enthusiasts alike saw in the Martian formation an uncanny echo of Machu Picchu, the mountaintop city built by the Inca high in the Andes. The resemblance was not merely in the angles, but in the impression of design, of human hands shaping stone into order. For those who believed Mars once harbored civilization, the Inca city was a revelation. A second chapter after Cydonia, proof that the red planet carried not one anomaly, but many, scattered across its surface like fragments of a story half erased. NASA, of course, offered an explanation. They claimed the grid-like formation was the product of natural processes, cycles of frost and thaw that cracked the ground into straight lines over millions of years. In their description, the so-called city was nothing more than cracked ice patterns, illusions of geometry etched by climate rather than construction. But the dismissal, once again, carried the ring of familiarity. People had heard it before. The canals, the face, the pyramids. Each time the pattern was the same. What looked extraordinary was explained away as ordinary. What looked designed was called erosion. The repetition eroded trust. If the face had been declared a trick of light, and the pyramids had been called mesas, then why should the Inca city be any different? The weight of similarity to Earth's own sites was difficult to ignore. Machu Picchu's terraces and grids were designed for both survival and symbolism, aligning with sun and stone. The Martian counterpart, though silent and lifeless, seemed to carry the same architectural rhythm. It invited comparisons too rich to dismiss, and for believers, it deepened the suspicion that Earth and Mars shared more than just a position in the solar system. They shared builders. They shared vision. They shared legacy. Yet even this was not the strangest revelation. In 2009, during a televised interview about future missions to Mars, astronaut Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, made an offhand comment that would reverberate through the mystery. Speaking not as a scientist carefully hedging words, but as a veteran explorer, he said, "There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object that goes around Mars once every 7 hours. When people find out about that, they're going to say, 'Who put that there?'" He was not speaking of Mars itself, but of its moon, Phobos. Phobos is a small, irregularly shaped satellite, battered by impacts and scarred by grooves. But on its surface stands a feature that appears uncannily vertical, a towering block, nearly 85 meters high, casting a long shadow across the barren terrain. To NASA, it is a boulder, the remnant of some ancient impact. But to Aldrin, and to the millions who heard his words, it was something far stranger. He called it a monolith, a word heavy with cultural resonance, recalling Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, A Space Odyssey, where black monoliths stood as markers of alien intelligence. Whether Aldrin meant it literally or playfully, his words carried authority. He had been to space, he had walked another world, and when he asked, "Who put that there?" it did not sound like fiction. It sounded like revelation. The Phobos monolith quickly joined the catalog of Martian enigmas. Alongside the face, the pyramids, and the Inca city, It stood as another piece of evidence. Another suggestion that Mars and its moons were not barren, after all, but archives of something ancient, something intentional. Images of the monolith circulated, its sharp outline standing against the irregular landscape like a sentinel. To some, it was proof of construction. To others, it was at least proof that Mars still had secrets, that not everything could be written off as dust and erosion. Together, the anomalies painted a picture difficult to ignore. If the face was dismissed as illusion, and the pyramids as mesas, then the Inca city and the Phobos monolith reopened the door. How many illusions could pile up before coincidence collapsed under its own weight? How many patterns could be dismissed before dismissal itself became less believable than the alternative? The more anomalies emerged, the more the official explanations felt like ritual, repeated without conviction, designed not to illuminate, but to pacify. And in the quiet spaces between photographs and explanations, imagination thrived. Writers speculated that Mars had once been home to a vast civilization, stretching across its plains, carving monuments, building cities, leaving markers on its moons. Perhaps they had thrived in a distant epoch, before catastrophe swept them away. Perhaps they had even traveled to Earth, carrying with them the seeds of culture, teaching early humans the arts of stone and sky. The Inca city on Mars and the Inca ruins on Earth became linked, not just by name, but by destiny. To some, this was no coincidence but a signature, a deliberate echo left to remind us that we are not alone, that we are not the first. Skeptics scoffed, as skeptics must. They argued that frost cracks and boulders require no architects, that similarity does not equal causation, that human eyes will always see what they long to see. Yet even they could not entirely erase the allure of the images. The monolith on Phobos stood too starkly, too vertically, to be ignored. The grids of Lucus Planum carried too much symmetry to be forgotten. Whether artificial or natural, they carried beauty. And beauty, too, has its power. By the dawn of the new millennium, Mars was no longer a blank slate. It was a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten, each new mission adding strokes, each new anomaly layering meaning. The Inca city, the monolith, the glass tunnels and domes, all became part of a growing mythology. And like all myths, they did not need certainty to endure. They only needed questions, questions large enough to keep us staring upward, waiting for answers that may never come. The further rovers wandered across the Martian surface, the more the planet began to resemble a museum of enigmas. Cydonia had given us the face and the pyramids. Lucus Planum had offered the Inca city. Phobos revealed its monolith. But Mars was not finished. Each new generation of cameras, mounted on robotic explorers crawling across the dust, brought images that refused to remain silent. Among them were photographs that seemed to capture not just rocks, but ruins. One of the most debated sets of images showed long, translucent shapes stretching across the Martian desert, shimmering faintly as though light itself was trapped within. These structures were quickly dubbed glass tunnels. To some, they looked like the remnants of transport systems, covered pathways that might once have sheltered travelers from wind and radiation. The tubes appeared to snake across the landscape, partially buried in sand, fractured in places as if centuries of storms had shattered them. NASA's explanations were familiar. They spoke of sand dunes and geological layering, tricks of shadow and reflection. But to those who studied the photographs obsessively, the features looked too uniform, too distinct. The tunnels, they believed, were not the work of dust and wind, but of engineers long vanished. Near these images, other structures surfaced. Domes half collapsed, as though roofs had caved in upon themselves. One, in particular, looked like the shattered remains of a spherical building, a shell of stone broken under the weight of time. Dubbed simply the Dome, it became another artifact in the gallery of Martian mysteries. If the face resembled a monument and the pyramids a city square, then the dome looked like shelter, a place where life had once gathered under cover. Again, official voices described it as a natural collapse, a hill weathered into roundness. But again, the dismissals only deepened curiosity. Then came a photograph from NASA's Curiosity rover that made headlines far beyond the circles of believers. In it, a rectangular opening yawned from the side of a rock formation. Clean, straight-edged, casting a shadow into darkness, it looked like nothing so much as a doorway. The resemblance was uncanny. On Earth, such a shape would never be mistaken for accident. It would be called architecture. On Mars, NASA insisted it was a fracture, a crack formed by shifting rock. Yet the simplicity of the explanation collided with the starkness of the image. If it was a crack, it was a crack with geometry, and geometry has always whispered of builders. People stared at the doorway with a mixture of wonder and unease. Was it an entrance to a cavern, perhaps even to an underground complex? Had life once hidden beneath the surface, safe from radiation and storms? Or was it nothing more than our minds, again, reaching for meaning? The photograph was circulated endlessly online, debated in forums, dissected in magazines. The possibility of a door was too primal, too deeply coded in the human imagination to ignore. A door means passage. A door means there is something behind it. And Mars, already heavy with mystery, seemed to invite us to knock. The catalogue of anomalies did not stop there. High-resolution images revealed what some called the White Tower, a skyscraper-like shape rising starkly against its surroundings. Its shadow stretched long and thin, as if cast by a vertical column impossible to explain with mere geology. Was it a trick of lighting? A ridge viewed from the right angle? Or was it something artificial? A relic of architecture built on a scale that defied expectation. The White Tower joined the growing list of Martian landmarks that inspired awe and suspicion in equal measure. Together, these features began to form a chorus. Glass tunnels, domes, doors, towers, each could be dismissed individually as coincidence, illusion, geology. But taken together, they painted a pattern that resisted easy erasure. For those inclined to believe, they were not accidents, but fragments of a larger story, a story of a civilization that had once flourished across the Martian plains. For skeptics, they were reminders of the mind's power to weave patterns into randomness. But either way, the images captured attention. They became symbols, touchstones for a collective longing to discover that humanity was not unique, that the cosmos carried neighbors, teachers, or ancestors. The reaction on Earth mirrored reactions throughout history when ruins are uncovered. When explorers first stumbled upon lost cities in jungles or deserts, they marveled at collapsed walls and silent streets, evidence of lives long gone. Mars now seemed to offer the same. Ruins scattered across its scarred surface, waiting for someone brave enough to call them by name. But unlike ruins on Earth, these could not be entered, touched, or excavated. They existed only in photographs, ambiguous and distant, demanding faith as much as science. What made them so powerful was not only their form, but their timing. They arrived in an era when humanity itself was questioning permanence. Cities on Earth grew ever more fragile under the weight of war, climate, and time. To see domes collapsed and towers broken on Mars was to glimpse our own possible future, written across another planet's past. The ruins of Mars became, in the imagination, warnings as much as wonders. And still, NASA insisted on natural explanations: sand dunes, fractures, lighting, coincidence. To their scientists, the features were geological quirks, fascinating but not mysterious. Yet for the public, the pattern was too strong. Dismissal without proof began to look less like caution and more like fear. What, people asked, was so dangerous about admitting the possibility of design? What was at stake in the refusal to consider the extraordinary? The anomalies kept piling up, forming a kind of architecture of doubt. Each image, ambiguous on its own, joined the others in a chorus that was harder to ignore. Whether glass tunnels or doorways, domes or towers, they beckoned with the same silent insistence. Look closer, look again. Do not accept silence as an answer. And humanity, staring across the gulf at that red world, found itself compelled. For even if every feature were natural, the effect was the same. They had made Mars alive in the imagination. They had turned a barren desert into a landscape of questions. And questions, more than answers, are what draw us forward across oceans, across deserts, across space. Mars had become not only a world to study, but a mystery to inhabit. A place where every shadow whispered of possibility, and every rock carried the weight of wonder. As the 21st century pushed forward, the mystery of Mars began to shift from shapes in photographs to chemistry beneath the soil. In 2012, NASA's Curiosity rover touched down on the planet, descending through thin atmosphere on a sky crane that looked almost like science fiction itself. Unlike Viking, which had given us images to puzzle over, Curiosity carried the tools of a geologist, a mobile laboratory capable of scooping Martian dust, heating it, and analyzing the gases released. It was designed to search for the building blocks of life, or at the very least, the chemical fingerprints left behind by processes more complex than wind and erosion. What it found startled even those who had dismissed the monuments of Cydonia as fantasy. Within the samples, scientists detected unusual levels of an isotope called xenon-129. On Earth, this isotope is not common in natural settings. In fact, there is only one known process that produces it in large quantities: the detonation of nuclear weapons. The implication was chilling. If xenon-129 saturated the Martian soil, then something catastrophic might once have happened there, something violent and final. The dry deserts of Mars, long imagined as peaceful wastelands, suddenly whispered of war. To the mainstream scientific community, the discovery was puzzling but not conclusive. There were attempts to explain the isotope as the result of natural cosmic radiation or ancient planetary processes. But those explanations felt thin, patched together to protect a worldview in which civilizations did not wage nuclear war on other planets. For independent researchers, however, the presence of xenon-129 was confirmation of what the monuments had always suggested. Mars had once been alive, and then Mars had been destroyed. The theory of a Martian nuclear holocaust gained momentum. Writers speculated that a thriving civilization had once spread across the red planet, building cities, carving monuments, leaving behind pyramids and faces, domes and tunnels. Then came annihilation. Whether through internal conflict, war between factions, or some cosmic event redirected as a weapon, the civilization had perished in fire. The traces of their destruction remained locked in the soil, waiting for machines from Earth to uncover them millions of years later. The face and the pyramids became not only relics of culture, but tombstones of an apocalypse. This hypothesis resonated because it echoed our own fears. On Earth, the Cold War had nearly ended in nuclear devastation. Even after its thaw, the shadow of atomic fire lingered. To imagine Mars as a planet wiped out by its own weapons was to imagine our future written into someone else's past. The parallels were too stark to ignore. If Mars had once been what Earth is now, alive with ambition, daring enough to build monuments against time, and if Mars had ended in nuclear ruin, then what warning did its silence carry for us? The soil of Mars became, in this way, a scripture. Xenon 129 was not merely an isotope, it was a word in a language of catastrophe, a message left in the dust. For those willing to read it, the message was clear. Civilizations die not only by accident, but by their own hands. The monuments of Cydonia could be ruins not of time, but of violence. And if the builders of Mars had fallen, what arrogance allowed us to believe we were immune? NASA remained cautious. Official papers spoke of alternative explanations, of unknown geological processes, but their hesitance only fueled suspicion. For every careful phrase, believers heard evasion. Why, they asked, was the most obvious explanation, the one tied to known physics, so quickly brushed aside? Why was nuclear war on Mars considered less likely than processes no one could describe in detail? The refusal to confront the possibility became itself a form of evidence. It suggested not only fear of scientific ridicule, but fear of what the revelation would mean for humanity. The cultural reaction was profound. Documentaries spoke of Mars as a once blue planet, rich with rivers and air, perhaps even forests. Then came destruction, leaving behind deserts and ruins. The face became more than a monument. It became a casualty, a survivor of catastrophe staring upward with silent testimony. The pyramids became not temples of worship, but symbols of endurance, still standing after their makers were ashes. Every anomaly, the domes, the tunnels, the doorway, the tower, took on new weight as relics of a civilization cut down not by time alone, but by fire. Writers compared Mars to myth. The Greek tales of Atlantis, a great city sunk beneath the sea after offending the gods, now seemed less like legend and more like memory. Perhaps not of Earth, but of Mars. What if Atlantis was not a city on our oceans, but a metaphor for a planet destroyed across space? The idea may have been fantastical, but it carried the rhythm of myth retold as history. Mars was no longer just another world. It was a warning. And yet, even in this dire picture, hope flickered. If the Martians had once walked their deserts, built their pyramids, shaped their cities, then intelligence was not a singular miracle of Earth. It was a cosmic pattern, one that could arise on more than one world. If Mars had fallen, perhaps others had risen elsewhere. Perhaps the same instinct that drove us to study the stars was the instinct of survivors, inheritors of a universe both creative and destructive. For many, the xenon in the Martian soil was not simply data. It was poetry, a verse in a cosmic epic in which civilizations rise, shine, and fall. We had stumbled onto a page written long before our time, and it told of ambition, ruin, and silence. Whether the story was real or imagined, it bound us to Mars in a way no photograph ever could. We were not simply explorers of another planet. We were readers of its obituary. And still, the planet lay ahead, red and silent, waiting for more machines, more eyes, more questions. The soil had given us whispers of devastation, but whispers are not enough. If Mars had once lived and died by its own hand, then its ruins might still hold answers. And if those answers are found, they may not only tell us of Mars, they may tell us of ourselves. When whispers of nuclear fire on Mars began to circulate, the conversation naturally turned back toward Earth. If the red planet once held monuments and cities, then what link, if any, connected them to the stone giants we walk among today? The pyramids of Giza had already long baffled historians with their precision, their alignments to the stars, their sheer scale. Standing at the edge of the Sahara, gazing up at those limestone slopes that have resisted time for more than 4,000 years, it is impossible not to ask the same questions posed of Cydonia. Who built these? Why? And with what knowledge? On Earth, the answers are wrapped in a fog of theory, pharaohs and dynasties, workforces counted in the tens of thousands, ramps and ropes and ingenuity. But in the shadows of that fog, other voices have whispered that perhaps the builders were not only human, or not entirely of this world. The comparisons are seductive. The D&M pyramid on Mars, with its five-sided symmetry, echoes ratios like phi and pi, constants also found encoded in the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Both seem to rise from geometric principles rather than chance. The city square of Cydonia, with its clustered pyramids, resembles not random hills, but planned complexes, not unlike Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the pyramids of the sun and moon align along a grand avenue mapped to celestial cycles. And in the high altiplano of Bolivia, at Tiwanaku, ruins of massive stone blocks remain scattered in patterns that seem to defy the tools available to their supposed builders. To draw lines between them is tempting, for all carry the same echo: precision, alignment, endurance. On Earth, archaeologists argue for cultural continuity, for shared human impulses to connect heaven and earth through architecture. But when faced with the possibility of Martian monuments, some dared to suggest another story. What if these similarities are not coincidental but ancestral? What if the same architects who raised pyramids on Mars long before our time also guided the hands of humans here? The thought is not proof, but it is powerful. It suggests that Earth's earliest civilizations may not have arisen in isolation, but with memory seeded from beyond. Of course, mainstream historians recoil from such notions. To them, the pyramids of Egypt are products of a society that had mathematics, labor, and vision, no Martian intervention required. The temples of Mexico and the stones of Bolivia are the triumphs of human cultures rooted deeply in their landscapes. To invoke extraterrestrial builders, they argue, is to diminish the brilliance of ancient people. And yet the resonance between Earth and Mars remains, not only in structure, but in myth. For what are myths if not echoes of memory, reshaped through generations, across cultures, stories of visitors from the sky recur, the gods who descended to teach agriculture, the shining beings who imparted laws, the architects who raised great stones. In Mesopotamia, tales of the Anunnaki speak of deities who came from the heavens, teaching humanity the arts of civilization. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was described as a bearded god from afar, bearer of knowledge. In Egypt, Osiris was remembered as one who descended to bring order. These myths are not proof, but they carry a rhythm that suggests humanity has long sensed it was not entirely alone in its achievements. If Mars once held builders, perhaps their story is written not only in stone, but in our legends. The possibility raises uncomfortable questions. If Earth's monuments share lineage with those on Mars, does that mean human history is incomplete? Are we inheritors of a legacy we have forgotten? And if so, why was it forgotten? Was the link severed by catastrophe, the same catastrophe that left Mars barren? Or was it deliberately erased, buried beneath layers of myth and time until only whispers remained? For believers, the similarities are too many to ignore. The geometry of Giza, the layout of Teotihuacan, the massive stones of Tiwanaku, all seem to rhyme with the formations of Cydonia. The rhyme may be coincidence, but coincidence itself can take on meaning when repeated so often, and if Mars truly suffered destruction by its own hand, then perhaps Earth's myths of floods and fires, of civilizations lost, are not only allegories, but memories, fractured and reframed through survival. In this way, the anomalies of Mars do not stand alone. They form a mirror with Earth's mysteries, each reflecting the other. The face carved into Martian dust reflects the Sphinx of Egypt, silent watcher of the desert. The pyramids of Cydonia reflect the pyramids of Earth, standing as equations in stone. The Inca city reflects Machu Picchu, terraces and grids aligned to the sun. Even the Phobos monolith finds echoes in the obelisks and standing stones raised across our world. Patterns repeat, as if the universe itself insists upon them. Skeptics counter that humans have always built with triangles and squares, always sought the heavens, always left monuments. Similarity does not require contact, but even as they speak, the allure of the grander story persists. To imagine that Earth and Mars were once chapters of the same epic is to give our small planet a place in a cosmic heritage, a history larger than we have dared to admit. It is not evidence, but it is myth in the making, and myths have power. The soil of Mars may carry isotopes of destruction, but its stones may carry echoes of intention. Whether sculpted by hands or shaped by chance, they invite us to compare, to question, to wonder. For if Mars was once alive with builders, then Earth is not alone. We are part of a continuum, not the first, not the only, perhaps not even the latest. The monuments we revere on our world may be both our triumph and our inheritance. And so, when we walk among the pyramids of Giza or climb the steps of Teotihuacan, we may be closer to Mars than we realize, not in distance, but in memory. The stones beneath our feet may carry not only the weight of human ambition, but the shadow of another world, one that tried to leave its story written in stone before vanishing into silence. Whether myth or history, the resonance endures. And in that resonance, we hear not only echoes of the past, but warnings for the future. While independent researchers drew bold lines between Mars and Earth's ancient monuments, NASA remained steadfast in its resistance. To their geologists, the formations in Cydonia were mesas, the Inca city was cracked ice, the Phobos monolith was a boulder, the tunnels were dunes. The official language rarely changed, a rhythm of dismissal that sounded less like curiosity and more like mantra. Wind, erosion, coincidence. These three words became the refrain of every press release. Yet with each repetition, the explanation grew thinner, like fabric stretched too far. People wondered, if the features were truly so ordinary, why did the agency feel compelled to deny them so persistently? Why not let them fade into irrelevance on their own? By defending so fiercely, NASA seemed only to confirm that something was at stake. For the wider public, the denials began to sound less like science and more like fear. Fear not of erosion, but of what acceptance might unleash. If Mars had once held civilization, the implications would ripple through religion, history, politics, and identity. Humanity would no longer stand alone. The myths of gods descending from the sky might suddenly be read as history. The pyramids of Earth would no longer be purely human triumphs, but echoes of a shared cosmic heritage. Such revelations could be destabilizing. And so, to many, NASA's silence and dismissal looked like guardianship, a deliberate gatekeeping of truths too vast to admit. The cultural imagination, however, did not wait for permission. The anomalies of Mars became embedded in a new kind of mythology, one born not from temples or oral traditions, but from images transmitted across space. Grainy photographs and pixelated scans became sacred texts of a modern age, studied and debated with the fervor once reserved for scripture. People gathered in late-night forums, on radio call-ins, in early internet chat rooms, dissecting shadows, as if decoding prophecy. The face in Cydonia became a mask of memory. The pyramids became equations left as legacy. The Inca city became proof of order where none should exist, and the monolith on Phobos became a sentinel, watching silently from orbit like a cosmic obelisk. In this new mythology, NASA played the role of priesthood, not revealing truth, but concealing it, guarding it, doling out fragments while withholding the whole. This perception, whether fair or not, gave the story of Mars a narrative tension it might not otherwise have possessed. Every denial became another chapter. Every blurred photograph became another secret. The very act of concealment became proof of conspiracy. In the absence of transparency, imagination filled the void. And imagination is rarely modest. Books and documentaries proliferated. Some argued that Mars was once Earth-like, with oceans, rivers, and perhaps even forests, before catastrophe reduced it to desert. Others claimed that survivors of Mars had come to Earth, guiding humanity through its infancy. Still others speculated that the builders of Mars were not Martians at all, but visitors from beyond, passing through worlds like way stations, leaving monuments as messages. These theories were often contradictory, but their energy came from the same source, the refusal to accept silence as the final answer. NASA, for its part, tried to counter with science. New missions were launched, new rovers sent to crawl across the planet's surface. Each time, the official story was the same. Rocks, dust, wind. But the pattern of disappointment continued. Images promised in high resolution appeared strangely degraded. Missions designed to clarify anomalies often failed at the most opportune moment. The Mars observer vanished. The catbox photos blurred. Even when curiosity revealed the Xenon 129 in Martian soil, the finding was immediately wrapped in cautious explanations that avoided the simplest conclusion. To believers, this pattern was not incompetence, but choreography, a deliberate effort to control the narrative. Yet in truth, the divide was not only between NASA and the public, it was also within humanity itself. For skeptics, belief in Martian ruins was evidence of desperation, of our tendency to impose meaning on chaos. For believers, skepticism was evidence of fear, of our refusal to confront a history that might expand our place in the cosmos. Both sides projected themselves onto the same photographs, the same shadows. The face remained the same, but what it meant depended on who looked. In that sense, the mystery was not only about Mars, it was about us. The mythology grew stronger because it was not tied to proof. Proof can end a story, but mystery keeps it alive. As long as the face could be seen both as illusion and as monument, it endured. As long as the pyramids could be mesas or temples, the debate thrived. The ambiguity was oxygen, and so, in a paradox, NASA's refusal to admit the extraordinary preserved the extraordinary. By denying, they ensured the survival of the myth. In coffee shops, classrooms, and basements glowing with the light of computer screens, the story of Mars became a shared secret. Even those who laughed at it found themselves drawn in, compelled to look at the photographs, to squint at the shadows, to wonder if just maybe. The myths of antiquity had been carved in stone, painted on walls, sung in fireside tales. The myth of Mars was carved in pixels, broadcast in radio static, whispered in headlines. Different medium, same hunger. Humanity was doing what it had always done, filling silence with meaning, turning uncertainty into story. And in that story, Mars ceased to be a barren planet. It became a character, a fallen world with scars that spoke of glory and ruin. It became a mirror, reflecting our fears of destruction and our hopes of survival. The refusal of institutions to acknowledge it only made it more alluring, for forbidden knowledge always carries a special magnetism. To be told, there is nothing to see is to be invited to look closer. And so people did. The myths endured because they spoke to something larger than science. They spoke to the human longing not to be alone, not to be temporary, not to be forgotten. In the face of an indifferent cosmos, the idea that another civilization had once existed, had built, had dreamed, had fallen, was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it hinted at our own fragility. Comforting because it suggested we were part of something larger, a continuum of intelligence scattered across the stars. Mars became our lost sibling, a brother or sister silenced by catastrophe, leaving behind ruins we were only beginning to decipher. And whether or not those ruins were real mattered less than the fact that we believed they might be. Belief itself gave them life. And in that life, a new mythology was born, one that continues to haunt us, whispering from the dust of another world. The mythology of Mars did not grow in isolation. It grew in the shadow of our own fragility. As people stared at the images of Cydonia, or replayed the words of Buzz Aldrin about the monolith on Phobos, they were also living in a century haunted by the possibility of self-destruction. Nuclear weapons still hung over humanity like a sword, and the memory of the Cold War was fresh enough that the phrase, mutually assured destruction, had not yet lost its chill. When Curiosity's analysis suggested isotopes linked to nuclear detonation on Mars, The resonance was immediate. It was impossible not to see ourselves reflected in the dust of another world. If Mars had once lived, had once built monuments to its ambition, then its silence was more than a mystery. It was a warning. This is what gave the Martian myths their strange urgency. They were not only tales of what might exist beyond Earth, but of what could happen here. The face staring up from the sand was no longer just a curiosity. It was a mirror. It looked back at us with hollow eyes, asking whether we too would leave only stone behind, whether our cities would someday crumble into dust so fine that only distant eyes would wonder if we had been real. The pyramids of Cydonia were not simply equations in rock, but reminders of how ambition and impermanence dance together. We too build with stone and steel, convinced our monuments will last. Yet what is Rome now but ruin? What is Babylon but memory? What will New York or Tokyo or Cairo be in 1,000 years? In Mars, we saw not aliens, but ourselves projected into the deep future. Gone, forgotten, silent. The nuclear war hypothesis gave that silence a cause, and one we understood too well. Perhaps the Martians had waged their own Cold War, escalating until fire consumed them. Perhaps their weapons poisoned the atmosphere, stripping it of protection, leaving their oceans to evaporate and their soil to crack. In that story, Mars was Atlantis multiplied by a planet, a civilization that drowned not in water, but in radiation. It was apocalypse written in chemistry, xenon atoms carrying a memory older than history. And the lesson was blunt. Intelligence is not immunity. Progress does not guarantee survival. A civilization can rise to heights of geometry and architecture, only to fall in a single violent century. Such thoughts took hold not only among enthusiasts, but among ordinary people who had lived through decades of duck-and-cover drills and mushroom cloud fears. To them, Mars was proof that the nightmare could be real. If they could fall, so could we. It was not only curiosity that drew people to the story of Cydonia, but dread. The fascination was not purely about life beyond Earth, but about death, the kind that comes not from nature but from our own inventions. The myth of Mars became entwined with the myth of our possible end. And yet, in that dread, there was also hope. If Mars had once lived, then intelligence was not a solitary miracle confined to Earth. It was a phenomenon that could emerge more than once, on more than one world. If it had happened there, it could happen again elsewhere. And if it had ended in ruin, then perhaps we could learn from it, avoid the same path. Mars became both ghost and teacher, both warning and promise. In its silence, we imagined a voice telling us, "Do not repeat our mistake." This duality, terror and hope, ruin and possibility, gave the Martian anomalies their staying power. They were not just curiosities of geology, but vessels for meaning. The doorway cut into rock was not only a fracture, but an invitation. The dome was not only a collapsed hill, but a reminder of shelter lost. The White Tower was not only a trick of light, but a monument still standing after all else had fallen. Each anomaly became a parable, and parables survive not because they are proven, but because they are believed. The skeptics countered, as always, with caution. They argued that imagination was filling in what data lacked, that science must not be sacrificed to fear or fantasy, and they were right in their way. But even their caution proved the point. For why did people cling so fiercely to these anomalies, even when told again and again they were illusions, because they spoke to something deeper than science. They spoke to the human hunger for meaning, for connection, for story. Science tells us how, but story tells us why. And Mars, silent and distant, had become the stage for a story about us. In classrooms, teachers showed the photographs as curiosities, careful not to endorse too much speculation, but unable to keep their students from gasping at the resemblance. In living rooms, families watched documentaries and argued about whether NASA was hiding the truth. On radio and in print, debates flared between experts and enthusiasts, each side unwilling to yield. The face in the sand was no longer just a geological riddle. It had become a cultural fault line, dividing those who demanded only proof from those who demanded also meaning. As the years turned, the myth did not weaken. It strengthened because time itself gave it weight. If no decisive proof came, then the mystery remained alive. Each new image, each new explanation became another layer of the same story. The world of silence that might once have sung with voices. The myth of Mars fed into novels, films, and conversations, embedding itself into popular culture. Children grew up not only with astronauts and rovers, but with the idea that another civilization might once have existed just one planet away. And whether true or not, that idea shaped the way they looked at the stars, not with indifference, but with wonder. For in the end, Mars didn't need to reveal its secrets to change us. It had already done so. By forcing us to imagine its past, it had forced us to imagine our future. By staring back with the shape of a face, it had made us confront the possibility of our own extinction, and by carrying whispers of xenon in its soil, it had reminded us that fire leaves marks long after it burns out. Mars was not only a mystery to solve, but a story to live with. A story of life, ruin, and silence, and of the fragile thread that binds them together. The story of Mars had long since broken the boundaries of science. By the time Curiosity's findings circulated, the debate had already shifted into philosophy. People were no longer asking only what was on Mars, but why the idea mattered so much. Why did the human imagination seize on a grainy photograph of a face or a shadow that resembled a doorway? Why did we insist on seeing cities in grids of stone, temples in collapsed domes, and warnings in isotopes? The answer, perhaps, lies not only in Mars, but in us. We are creatures of memory, creatures of myth, and when we look into the void, we carry those instincts with us. For some thinkers, the Martian anomalies were not just potential ruins, but metaphors for human longing. The face in Cydonia, staring upward across space, became a symbol of recognition, a reminder that we are always searching for ourselves in the universe. It did not matter whether it was truly carved by intelligent hands or sculpted by wind and shadow. The power lay in its resemblance, in the way it mirrored us. It gave shape to our desire not to be alone. When we saw eyes in the desert, it was because we wanted the universe to have eyes, to look back. The pyramids, too, carried this symbolic weight. Across Earth, pyramids are among the most enduring structures we have built, monuments that defy centuries of weather and conquest. To see them echoed on Mars was to imagine permanence beyond Earth, a continuity of ambition. Even if no Martians ever raised them, the idea that pyramids appear in more than one world suggested a universality of form, a geometry of meaning that transcends cultures and planets alike. The pyramid is both tomb and temple, both grave and aspiration. To find it on Mars was to believe that the drive to leave something eternal behind is not only human, but cosmic. Philosophers pointed out that even if the anomalies were natural, their role as myths was undeniable. Myths, after all, are not about proof, but about function. They give structure to our fears and hopes. They explain our place in a world too vast to comprehend. Ancient people saw gods in storms and constellations because they needed stories that explained the chaos around them. We see faces on Mars because we need to believe that intelligence, like chaos, is not confined to one fragile planet. The myth of Mars was not accidental. It was inevitable. In a universe silent and immense, we are compelled to populate it with meaning. NASA's denials, in this light, were almost irrelevant. Whether the agency insisted the anomalies were illusions or not, the myth had already taken root. The grainy photographs had become modern cave paintings, etched into the collective imagination. People studied them not only for evidence but for meaning, the way ancient shamans studied the shapes of stars. The face and the pyramids were not only on Mars, they were in us. They became part of the ongoing story of humanity's relationship with the unknown. A story that stretches back to when the first human looked at the night sky and asked, "Who else is out there?" The myth also carried with it a sense of responsibility. If Mars had once lived and died, then perhaps Earth was not immune to the same fate. Philosophers called this the mirror effect, the way we use other worlds as screens onto which we project our destiny. To see ruins on Mars was to see potential ruins on Earth. To imagine nuclear devastation, there was to confront the possibility of devastation here. Mars became a rehearsal for our own ending, a cosmic memento mori, reminding us that civilizations are not guaranteed permanence. In that sense, the Martian myths did what myths have always done. They warned. Myths of floods and fires, of gods angered by hubris, of cities swallowed by the sea. They all served to remind us of fragility, to keep arrogance in check. Mars was Atlantis across a planet. Babel crumbled into dust. Sodom burned into silence. Whether real or not, its ruins carried moral weight. They whispered, "Learn from us. Do not repeat us." And yet, there was more than fear in the story. There was also comfort. If Mars once thrived, then intelligence is not unique. If ruins scatter its deserts, then life does not bloom only once in the universe, but perhaps many times. That thought is liberating. It suggests that even if humanity falls, intelligence will rise again elsewhere, on some other world, under some other sun. Our story would not be the end of the story. Mars, in its silence, offered not only a warning, but also a promise that intelligence is part of the fabric of the cosmos, not a lonely accident. In this way, the Martian anomalies functioned less like evidence and more like parables. They gave shape to questions larger than science. What does it mean to survive? What does it mean to leave a legacy? What does it mean to be alone? The face, the pyramids, the city grids, the domes, all of them became mirrors of our own condition, reminders that every civilization seeks permanence against time and yet risks collapse. Whether natural or artificial, they told us something true, even if not in the way believers intended. And so, Mars became less a planet than a philosophy. Each image became a meditation, each anomaly a koan in the riddle of existence. The debates over authenticity mattered less than the meanings we drew. Whether NASA concealed truth or whether erosion truly sculpted the formations, the result was the same. We were forced to confront ourselves in the mirror of another world. The mythology of Mars lived not because it was proven, but because it was necessary. And as long as we continue to gaze at the red planet, as long as we search its deserts for shadows and its soil for whispers, the myth will endure. For myths, unlike monuments, do not crumble. They evolve, they adapt, they survive. And the myth of Mars, carved first in stone and then in pixels, has already joined the long chain of stories humanity tells itself when staring into the dark. By the late 20th century, Mars was no longer only the domain of astronomers and engineers. It had become a stage for culture itself, a canvas where filmmakers, novelists, and visionaries painted their interpretations of the red planet's secrets. The anomalies, faces, pyramids, ruined grids, were fuel for imaginations already primed by decades of pulp stories and science fiction. When ordinary people stared at those blurry NASA photographs, they were not just looking at rocks. They were peering through a window that storytellers had already opened for them, a window where Mars was alive with memory, mystery, and loss. Hollywood, always hungry for symbols larger than life, seized the myth. Films did not need to mention Cydonia or quote from NASA archives to echo the themes. They showed ruined civilizations beneath dust storms, ancient cities buried under dunes, explorers stumbling across evidence of beings who had risen and fallen long before humans took their first steps on Earth. In those visions, Mars was more than a world. It was a reminder that progress is fragile, that intelligence is not immortal. The desert of the red planet was a mirror of our own potential collapse. Audiences watched in darkened theaters and left with the uneasy sense that the story was not only about Mars, but also about Earth. Literature, too, carried the myth forward. Writers expanded on the photographs, building entire mythologies out of a single shadow or alignment. Some imagined Mars as a twin of Earth, once flourishing with oceans and forests, now left to silence after catastrophe. Others cast it as a testing ground for cosmic architects, a place where civilizations rose and fell in cycles that we, too, might one day repeat. The idea of Martian ruins became a modern epic, a mythology that blended archaeology with prophecy. Even those who knew the science was doubtful found themselves seduced by the narrative power. A face staring upward from the desert was too haunting to ignore. Beyond books and films, the myth began to bleed into everyday culture. Talk shows speculated about government cover-ups. Documentaries played dramatic music over grainy images of Martian landscapes, treating them with the reverence once reserved for lost temples in the Amazon or uncharted tombs in Egypt. Conspiracy theorists found in Mars the perfect stage, a mystery distant enough to evade proof, yet close enough to feel tangible. The notion that NASA was hiding evidence of a destroyed Martian civilization became a story retold in whispers, online forums, and late-night radio. For many, the idea was not simply about Mars, but about trust. Whether authorities could be believed when they told us what to see or what not to see. As the myth spread, it absorbed the language of religion and spirituality. Mars became a kind of cosmic parable, a wasteland that once bore life and now bore warning. Some spiritual movements interpreted the anomalies as remnants of ancient star gods, beings who seeded Earth with life after their own world fell. Others spoke of karmic cycles, suggesting that Mars was a civilization destroyed by arrogance and violence, a lesson written across the solar system for any who had eyes to read. The red planet, once only a neighbor in the night sky, became a scripture written in dust and ruin. This cultural saturation gave Mars a second life. Long after science moved on, dismissing the face as shadow play and the pyramids as coincidence, the myth persisted because it had crossed the threshold into art and belief. A shadow in a photograph could be erased by better images, but the story that shadow inspired could not be undone. Once a culture absorbs a symbol, it remains, shifting and mutating, but never dying. The Martian ruins, whether real or not, had become one of those symbols. Even children absorbed the myth. Schoolbooks might not have mentioned the Cydonia face, but television, comics, and games echoed the themes. Mars was drawn as a place of mystery, where explorers uncovered traces of a forgotten people, where silence carried secrets. Entire generations grew up with an image of the red planet that was not simply barren but haunted. And in being haunted, it became relatable because we too live among ruins. We too measure ourselves against the silence of history. The impact on science itself was curious. While most researchers dismissed the anomalies, a few admitted that the public's fascination served a purpose. Funding for space exploration often relied on public support, and nothing stirred that support more than the promise of mystery. The possibility, however faint, of ruins and civilizations gave exploration urgency. It was not just geology that lay across the gulf, but the chance to answer the oldest of questions. Are we alone? Even if the photographs deceived us, the myth pushed rockets forward, driving us to look closer. By the dawn of the 21st century, Mars was no longer only a planet. It was a cultural phenomenon, a meeting ground where science, myth, philosophy, and art converged. The face in Cydonia had become iconic, reproduced in magazines, graffiti, even tattoos. The pyramids entered the collective imagination as surely as the pyramids of Giza or Teotihuacan. Whether scientists liked it or not, the myth of Mars had joined the pantheon of human stories, lodged alongside Atlantis, Babel, and Eden. And so, culture and science entered a strange dance. Science corrected, culture reimagined, and the myth endured between them. Every new rover photograph was scanned not only for data but for meaning. Every shadow might be a doorway, every boulder a statue. The myth had trained us to look for more than geology. It had trained us to look for ourselves. The red planet, once a blank page, was now a palimpsest layered with stories. The official narrative wrote of dust and basalt, while the cultural narrative wrote of temples and faces. Neither erased the other. They coexisted, parallel truths in the human imagination. To dismiss one as false and the other as true was to miss the point, because what mattered was not proof, but power. The myth had power. It gave shape to our questions, weight to our fears, and depth to our hope. Mars was no longer just out there. It was in here, inside us, a mirror of everything we long to discover and everything we dread to lose. As the 21st century unfolded, the mythology of Mars found a new home on the growing frontier of the Internet. What had once circulated in dusty books or late-night radio shows now surged through message boards, early forums, and eventually social media feeds. The face in Cydonia, once a niche obsession, became a digital icon. People could download the image, circle the eyes, trace the mouth, and post it for others to examine within minutes. Suddenly, the mystery was no longer confined to official channels or documentary crews. It belonged to everyone. Online communities sprang up, devoted to combing through every pixel of Martian photographs. NASA's releases, once the domain of specialists, were pored over by amateurs armed with home computers and endless curiosity. When a rover sent back new panoramas, the images were downloaded, magnified, and dissected. Every ridge was scrutinized, every shadow debated. Forums lit up with heated arguments. Was that a shard of machinery, the corner of a buried structure, or just a rock shaped by wind? The conversation itself was as important as the answer, because it gave people a sense of participation. They were no longer passive recipients of science. They were explorers, archaeologists of the screen. This democratization of mystery brought with it both wonder and distortion. In the glow of monitors across the world, the myth of Mars evolved at a pace faster than any official science could match. Stories grew wilder, fueled by digital rumor and the thrill of discovery. Some claimed entire cities were visible, with streets and walls eroded by eons. Others saw statues, bones, even doorways leading underground. A single blurry stone became the seed for elaborate narratives, spreading with the speed of a shared link. In this digital age, evidence mattered less than resonance. If an image felt mysterious, if it stirred awe or fear, it was shared. And in being shared, it gained credibility. The internet also allowed myths to cross-pollinate. Martian ruins were linked with stories of ancient astronauts, hidden histories of Earth, and suppressed technologies. The red planet became a node in a web of speculation, tied to everything from Atlantis to Roswell. Entire theories blossomed, suggesting that Mars was once home to a civilization that escaped its dying world by seeding Earth with life, that we are their descendants walking unknowingly in their shadow. Others whispered that secret missions had already landed on Mars decades ago, discovering ruins that were concealed from the public. In the endless expanse of online conversation, Mars was not merely a planet. It was a key to every locked door of imagination. Yet even as the stories grew extravagant, they reflected deeper truths about the human condition. The idea that Mars once flourished and then fell resonated with a world facing climate change, wars, and uncertainty. People saw in those imagined ruins a warning that no civilization, however advanced, was immune to collapse. The myth of Mars was a parable for Earth, a way of processing our own anxieties about survival. If Mars had fallen, then perhaps we too were vulnerable, and perhaps the universe was littered with the graves of those who thought themselves eternal. NASA and other agencies noticed this fascination, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes strategically. On one hand, scientists dismissed claims of ruins as pareidolia, the brain's tendency to see patterns where none exist. On the other hand, they knew that public engagement was vital for funding and support. If the myth kept people looking skyward, then perhaps it served a purpose. Some missions leaned into the excitement, releasing images with playful captions, allowing curiosity to flourish without endorsing the wilder theories. In this dance between science and myth, each fed the other. The clearer the photographs became, the more intricate the stories grew. Meanwhile, artists embraced the digital age to reimagine Mars in new forms. Music videos, digital paintings, and even video games portrayed the planet as a landscape of mystery, alive with the ghosts of a vanished people. Players wandered through simulated ruins, guided not by science, but by the collective myth that had taken root online. In this way, the culture of Mars expanded into interactive storytelling, giving each participant the power to shape the myth further. The line between evidence and invention blurred until it no longer mattered, because what mattered was the shared sense of wonder. This was the paradox of the Internet age. The more information was available, the more stories multiplied. High-resolution images debunked the face in Cydonia as a trick of shadow. Yet the myth persisted because it was no longer about a single formation. It was about what we saw when we stared long enough into silence. Every new rover photograph, no matter how mundane, was another canvas for imagination. In the endless scroll of feeds and forums, Mars became both a planet and a mirror, reflecting our hunger for meaning. Some thinkers compared this phenomenon to ancient oracles. Just as people once gazed into flames or patterns of stars to divine fate, the modern world gazed into pixels from another planet. The practice was the same: finding messages in patterns, seeking destiny in shapes. What had changed was the medium, not the impulse. The mythology of Mars revealed that even in an age of satellites and science, we still crave mystery. We still want the universe to speak back to us. And so, in the early decades of the new millennium, Mars was reborn once again. It was not just a barren desert of rock and dust. It was a story engine, a digital cathedral where countless voices gathered to speculate, argue, dream. The myth no longer needed a single discovery to survive. It had become self-sustaining, fed by culture, fear, and hope. The face in Cydonia might have been dismissed by science, but it lived on in art, in forums, in the collective imagination of a world that could not stop staring into the red horizon. As private space exploration entered the global stage, the mythology of Mars gained an unexpected ally in ambition. For decades, the planet had been the domain of governments, carefully measured by scientific institutions and bureaucratic caution. But the early 21st century saw a shift. Entrepreneurs stepped forward with visions that were less about cautious probes and more about building futures. Suddenly, the old myths of Martian civilizations collided with very real plans for colonization, and the line between science fiction and strategy blurred. Elon Musk, founder of SpaceX, became a central figure in this narrative. He spoke of Mars not as an abstract frontier, but as a destination within our grasp, a place where human footprints could soon mark the dust. His rhetoric borrowed unconsciously from centuries of myth: Mars as a new world, Mars as salvation from earthly fragility, Mars as a second chance. To his followers, this dream carried echoes of the ancient builders who, according to speculative lore, once walked the Red Plains. Colonizing Mars was not just about rockets. It was about continuity, about reclaiming a destiny left unfinished. Even skeptics noticed the poetry woven into the engineering. The technology that SpaceX and other companies developed brought the dream closer. Reusable rockets, heavy lift systems, life support simulations. Each milestone was celebrated not just for its practicality, but for what it represented. People shared images of test flights with the same fervor they once shared photographs of the Cydonia face. Every landing, every booster recovery was another verse in the unfolding story of human persistence. It was no longer just about asking whether Mars had been alive. It was about ensuring Mars would be alive again, this time through us. But woven into the excitement was a shadow, a lingering echo from the myths. If Mars had once been home to a civilization, why had it died? Could we avoid the same fate? Musk spoke of planetary backups, of humanity as a multi-planet species to hedge against extinction. His words carried the weight of the old Martian parable, a reminder that even advanced societies could fall. Colonizing Mars became not only an act of exploration, but an act of survival. The ruins, whether real, imagined, or symbolic, were warnings carved into the dust. Other voices joined the chorus. Writers and futurists argued that settling Mars was not simply about engineering, but about cultural memory. If we went to Mars, they said, we would carry our myths with us. We would walk in the footsteps of imagined ancestors, and every dome, every greenhouse, every habitat would be haunted by the possibility that we were not the first. The mythology enriched the vision. It gave colonization a sense of narrative continuity, as though we were returning rather than arriving. In classrooms, children learned about Mars not only as a planet of rocks, but as a place of stories. Teachers used the myth of Martian collapse to teach lessons about climate change, resource management, and human fragility. Mars became a mirror through which Earth's own challenges were projected. Even if the ruins were illusions, the warnings they represented were real. This blending of fact and story, of hard science and speculative narrative, gave Mars a power few other destinations could claim. Yet there were those who feared this mythology could distort the mission. Scientists cautioned against romanticizing colonization as destiny, warning that the reality of survival on Mars was brutal: radiation, thin atmosphere, toxic soil. They argued that clinging to myths could distract from the harsh engineering truths. A habitat could not be built from legends. Still, they admitted that without the pull of narrative, without the dream, public support might falter. Myths, after all, were fuel, intangible but necessary. The influence of mythology was visible even in design. Architects proposed Mars habitats shaped like ancient domes, echoing both practicality and memory. Artists imagined cities aligned with the same geometry as Earth's pyramids, invoking continuity between worlds. Colonization plans were often illustrated not with sterile diagrams, but with sweeping vistas of glass structures gleaming under a red sky, like futuristic ruins in reverse. These visions were not just engineering. They were storytelling, a way to make survival desirable. As technology advanced, the debate grew sharper. Were we reclaiming Mars, or were we escaping Earth? Musk's speeches about extinction struck some as pragmatic, others as fatalistic. Was the mythology of Mars as a fallen civilization a warning or a justification? For some, the myth said, "Do not repeat their mistakes." For others, it said, "They failed, but we can succeed." Mars thus became a philosophical battlefield as well as a technological one. Meanwhile, beyond the plans and debates, the myth continued to evolve in popular culture. Films depicted colonists uncovering ruins beneath the dust, suggesting that our future settlement would uncover our past. Television series blended exploration with archaeology, imagining astronauts who were also detectives of deep time. These stories found audiences precisely because they resonated with what people already felt, that Mars was not empty, that it was layered with memory, that stepping onto it was both arrival and return. The closer we drew to Mars in reality, the more inseparable myth and mission became. Rockets stood ready on launch pads, Prototypes of habitats were tested as deserts and polar regions, yet always in the background was the whisper of ruins. Colonizing Mars was not just engineering a future, it was writing a continuation of a story told for centuries. In every speech, every design, every photograph, the myth was there, shaping how we imagined the leap. Mars, then, was no longer only a mystery or a warning. It was a stage waiting for us to perform. Whether we arrived as conquerors, survivors, or pilgrims, we would bring with us the stories that had guided us here. The ruins we dreamed of might not exist in stone, but they existed in us, in our fears, in our hopes, in the narratives we spun to give meaning to the void. As private spaceflight advanced, the mythology of Mars proved that exploration was never only about where we go. It was always about who we believe we are. As the vision of colonizing Mars matured, a new set of questions rose to the surface, questions that were less about rockets and more about morality. Could humanity, in its rush to extend its reach, commit an act of violation? Terraforming, the process of reshaping a planet's environment to make it habitable for Earth life, had long been proposed as the ultimate goal. The idea carried a spark of godlike power to take a cold, arid desert and transform it into a world of oceans and air, a place where forests could root and generations of children could grow without pressure suits. Yet beneath the grandeur was a troubling echo. Were we restoring a world that had once been alive, or erasing a silent record of something that did not belong to us? Scientists who spoke in favor of terraforming framed it as destiny. Mars, they said, had resources waiting: frozen carbon dioxide, hidden water ice, a climate that could be coaxed back to warmth with enough engineering. They compared it to tending a neglected garden, one that had been abandoned but could bloom again. The myth of the lost Martian civilization fit neatly into this vision. Perhaps they had begun the work and failed, and we were picking up their tools. In this interpretation, terraforming was not desecration, but continuity, the completion of an unfinished project. Opponents, however, saw it differently. To them, terraforming was an act of cultural arrogance, a refusal to accept Mars as it was. If the planet held traces of ancient life, reshaping it could destroy evidence forever. Even if life no longer existed, the landscape itself might be considered sacred, a natural record of billions of years. Was it our right to overwrite that history with forests and lakes? Ethical philosophers compared it to painting over a prehistoric cave wall because the pictures did not suit modern taste. The idea of ownership weighed heavily. Who decided what was worth preserving? Who gave humanity the authority to decide the fate of another world? The tension was not only philosophical, but spiritual. For centuries, Mars had been a mirror for human longing. To some, it was a place of gods and warriors, a stage for mythology. To others, it was a symbol of survival, a refuge when Earth faltered. Terraforming struck a nerve because it combined both impulses: the mythic urge to conquer and the desperate need to endure. Yet with this came guilt. In whispers, people asked, if Mars had once fallen to ruin because of its own inhabitants, were we doomed to repeat the cycle by forcing it into a new shape? Environmentalists took a sharp stance. They reminded the public that humanity had not yet proven capable of caring for Earth. Oceans warmed, forests burned, species vanished, and yet here was talk of remaking another planet. Was this not escapism disguised as ambition? The myth of Mars as a lost civilization gained sharper teeth in this context. What if they too had exhausted their resources, warmed their climate, poisoned their air? Terraforming, in that light, seemed less like salvation and more like denial, a refusal to confront mistakes at home. Mars was not a new Eden. It was a mirror, reflecting our failures back at us. Still, the dream persisted. Engineers spoke of mirrors in orbit to focus sunlight, of vast factories releasing greenhouse gases, of microbes seeded in the soil to prepare the ground. Each proposal seemed like science fiction brought to life, and each was haunted by imagery of ruins. Popular imagination could not let go of the possibility that in sculpting a new Mars, we might bury the remnants of an older one. What if beneath the ice lay carvings? What if in the dust were bones, tools, cities? Every plan carried with it the risk of irreversible erasure. The debate spilled into art and literature. Some novels painted terraforming as triumph, domes falling away to reveal blue skies, rivers cutting valleys where once there was dust. Others depicted it as tragedy, archaeologists watching helplessly as evidence of a lost people vanished under imported algae blooms and engineered moss. Films showed colonists celebrating their greenhouses while ancient ruins crumbled just beyond the airlocks. These stories, though fictional, captured the unease better than scientific papers could. They spoke to a truth deeper than data, that every act of creation is also an act of destruction. Governments and organizations began to draft guidelines, anticipating the questions. Some proposed that parts of Mars be treated as planetary parks, protected zones where exploration was allowed, but alteration forbidden. Others suggested waiting until thorough surveys were completed before attempting any large-scale modification. But against these careful measures stood the urgency of survival. Advocates of terraforming argued that time was short, that Earth's crises demanded immediate action. Waiting centuries for permission meant risking extinction. The mythology of Mars as a warning was thus reinterpreted. If they had failed to act, perhaps that was why they perished. Religious voices joined the dialogue, adding another layer. Some saw terraforming as an extension of divine mandate, a fulfillment of humanity's role as stewards of creation. Others saw it as hubris, a Tower of Babel stretched across planets, a grasp for power that could only end in downfall. Sermons echoed with references to lost worlds and forgotten peoples, framing Mars not as an empty canvas but as a test of humility. Would we walk softly among the ruins, or would we trample them in the name of survival? In the end, the debate revealed more about us than about Mars. The red planet remained silent, neither inviting nor resisting. Its sands did not argue, its craters did not protest. The conflict unfolded in human minds, shaped by our myths and fears. To terraform Mars was to terraform ourselves, to decide what kind of species we wished to be: conquerors, gardeners, preservers, or inheritors. The myths gave us the language to ask these questions, even as science gave us the tools to attempt the answers. The planet waited. And in the stillness of its waiting, Mars reminded us that exploration is not only about distance, it is about reflection, about the choices we make when faced with silence vast enough to hold both our dreams and our guilt. The face in the sand, the pyramids in the dust, the possibility of ruins, they were less about Mars itself and more about the moral architecture we carried within. Whether we built greenhouses or preserved deserts, the truth was the same. Mars was not only a frontier, it was a mirror of our soul. Long before the first boot pressed into Martian dust, Mars had already colonized human culture. The red planet was not simply a world waiting to be touched. It was a stage upon which we rehearsed our anxieties, our hopes, and our visions of destiny. From the earliest novels to blockbuster films, Mars became a mirror in which civilization projected both triumph and collapse. It is no coincidence that when science revealed valleys and volcanoes, fiction filled them with cities and wars. The planet's silence begged for stories, and humanity, restless as ever, answered. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of Martian canals captivated readers. Astronomers like Percival Lowell described linear features that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Newspapers reported it as evidence of engineers beyond Earth, and suddenly, Mars was less an object of curiosity than a neighbor in crisis. Lowell believed the canals were irrigation projects built by a dying race to survive. The story was seductive because it echoed fears of scarcity on Earth. Droughts, industrial strain, populations pressing against their limits. To imagine Martians carving lifelines across their planet was to imagine ourselves, a century early, trying to engineer our own survival. Fiction writers leapt upon it, spinning tales of noble Martians, decadent Martians, aggressive Martians, all variations of ourselves painted onto the red backdrop. H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds inverted the fantasy. Instead of us peering across the void at a dying race, Wells imagined them peering back at us, hungry and desperate. His Martians arrived not as wise teachers but as predators, stripping Earth as we might strip Mars. The story electrified readers because it turned speculation into invasion. It reframed the question: what if the silence of Mars was not benign, but the prelude to footsteps on our own soil? This inversion lingered in popular consciousness, feeding not only literature, but entire genres of cinema. By the mid-20th century, pulp magazines and Hollywood discovered Mars as a canvas for spectacle. Red-skinned princesses, barbarian warlords, telepathic empires. Mars became both exotic and familiar, a fantasy realm where Earth's politics and passions were exaggerated. These stories, though often melodramatic, revealed a deeper truth. Mars was never about Mars. It was about us. The Cold War filtered its anxieties through Martian invaders, films showing bug-eyed aliens descending upon Earth with weapons of impossible energy. The message was clear. The alien was merely another face for the rival superpower, the stranger beyond the horizon who might arrive with fire. Mars, with its proximity and mystery, became the perfect stand-in for everything feared but not fully understood. As space probes began to send back photographs in the 1960s and 70s, a shift occurred. The pictures showed barren landscapes, dust, craters, deserts stretching beyond sight. The fantasies should have died here, yet instead they evolved. For some, the emptiness proved the myth wrong. Mars was lifeless, and all our stories were illusions. For others, the emptiness proved the myth right. If Mars was once alive, then the silence was evidence of catastrophe. The famous image of the face on Mars, captured by Viking in 1976, rekindled speculation with almost religious fervor. Was it a trick of light, or a monument left by a vanished people? Arguments raged, not only in fringe circles but in living rooms, newspapers, and late-night talk shows. For a public already steeped in myths, The photograph was fuel. It was as if Mars itself had winked at us, daring us to believe. This tension spilled into philosophy. Thinkers debated whether the human compulsion to find patterns, faces in clouds, canals in shadows, was a weakness or a form of insight. Did we invent the Martian civilization because we needed it, or did the planet leave clues precisely to awaken us? Academic journals dismissed such notions, but culture thrived on them. Conspiracy theories wove elaborate tapestries, claiming governments had discovered ruins on Mars but concealed them. Films and novels dramatized cover-ups, framing Mars as both the lost past and the forbidden future. It was not science, it was myth-making, but myths have a power data alone cannot erase. Music, too, absorbed the planet. From orchestral works like Holst's The Planets, where Mars was cast as the bringer of war, to modern rock and electronic albums inspired by its landscapes, the Red Planet was a muse. Painters splashed canvases with crimson horizons. Sculptors imagined alien artifacts. Fashion designers drew on the aesthetic of helmets and domes. Mars was not only a destination, it was an atmosphere, a texture, a tone. Its image infiltrated advertisements, political speeches, even children's cartoons. To grow up in the 20th century was to inherit Mars not as a geological body, but as a cultural companion, familiar even to those who had never looked through a telescope. The turn of the 21st century amplified the myth in new directions. The internet spread images and theories at dizzying speed. A blurry rock could become evidence of fossils overnight, shared across forums and websites. Mars became democratic. No longer controlled by astronomers or authors, it was shaped by anyone with an opinion and an audience. Social media transformed Martian anomalies into viral mysteries, from alleged doorways carved into cliffs to objects resembling bones scattered in dust. Scientists explained them as geology, but explanations often failed to extinguish wonder. In a sense, Mars was more alive in rumor than in fact. Even the dreamers of space exploration drew upon this mythology, whether consciously or not. Private companies promising to send settlers spoke in tones that echoed ancient narratives, the call to adventure, the new frontier, the salvation of humanity. Recruitment videos resembled trailers for epic films, filled with sweeping Martian vistas and voices speaking of destiny. The myth had become strategy. By painting Mars not only as a goal, but as a story, they invited ordinary people to invest emotionally, to see themselves not as spectators, but as characters within the unfolding drama. The persistence of these myths revealed something profound. Mars had never been inert. It functioned as a psychological catalyst, a screen upon which humanity could project its deepest stories of survival, ambition, and fear. Even when confronted with data showing dust and stone, people continued to dream of canals, faces, and cities. Myth filled the spaces where certainty fell silent, and perhaps that was not failure, but necessity. Exploration is never only about what is found, it is about what is imagined before it is found. By the time the first astronauts prepared to land, they carried more than scientific instruments. They carried the weight of centuries of storytelling. Every step they took would be read not only as discovery, but as continuation. To walk on Mars was to enter a myth older than rockets, to touch the surface of a world that had lived inside human minds for generations. Whatever they found, rocks, ruins, or silence, would never be free of that shadow. Mars was already part of us, and in setting foot there, we were not only exploring another planet, we were exploring ourselves. There comes a moment when the red horizon no longer looks distant but familiar, as if it were always waiting for us. After centuries of telescopes, sketches, fables, wars of the worlds, and images blurred by dust, humanity has finally carried its presence to Mars. Yet arrival does not silence the old questions, it makes them louder. Standing on Martian ground, the crunch of regolith beneath a boot, the hiss of oxygen inside a suit. These are not just sounds of exploration, but echoes of every story we ever told about this place. The reality is solid rock, but the weight pressing down on the human chest is also cultural, spiritual, mythical. We are not only walking on a planet, we are walking on centuries of our own imagination. The data keeps flowing, and with it, surprises that neither fiction nor skepticism can fully contain. Layers of sediment hint at rivers that once curled like blue veins across the plains. Salt deposits sparkle in light, remnants of oceans that vanished into air. Methane leaks flicker in and out of detection, teasing the possibility of microbial breath. Each clue resurrects the question of life, if not grand cities and statues, then at least organisms that defied the void for a time. The possibility that Mars once thrived, even in miniature, carries consequences that ripple far beyond geology. It would mean we are not a singular accident, not the only spark to leap from matter into metabolism. It would mean the cosmos is seeded with potential, and Mars is proof that Earth is not alone in carrying the burden of life. But exploration also uncovers silence, and silence itself is a lesson. The absence of grand ruins or surviving civilizations forces us to face the darker half of the myth. If Mars once bloomed and then died, what killed it? Was it climate shift, a thinning atmosphere, the slow evaporation of water into space? Or was it something more catastrophic, a war written in nuclear isotopes, as some fringe theorists claim? Whatever the cause, the message is clear. Planets are fragile, civilizations more so. To study Mars is to study the precariousness of endurance. It is a mirror showing us how close any world can drift from fertility to desolation. And yet, paradoxically, it is also a promise. For every ruin imagined, there is a city dreamed. Colonization proposals envision domes glittering like pearls on the dust, tunnels carved into lava tubes, greenhouses unfurling leaves beneath artificial suns. To some, these plans are reckless fantasy. To others, they are necessary rehearsal for survival. If Earth falters under its own weight, Mars is the next ark. Whether or not this vision proves possible, it testifies to a truth older than rockets. Humans are not content with a single horizon. Mars has always been a symbol of expansion, not just outward, but inward, forcing us to ask how much risk, how much sacrifice, how much reinvention we are willing to embrace for continuity. The paradox deepens when we consider memory. Imagine if we do build cities on Mars. What stories will those settlers tell? Will they remember the myths of canals, the nightmares of invasions, the dreams of faces in stone? Or will they craft new myths, born from storms of red dust and nights beneath two moons? Every civilization leaves its echoes. Perhaps the greatest irony would be if future Martian descendants forget Earth as thoroughly as we have forgotten Mars's own past. History may repeat not in battles but in amnesia, one world becoming legend to another. Philosophers warn that our hunger for Mars might be less about discovery than about escape. The question is not whether we can reach Mars, but why we feel compelled to. Is it a noble extension of curiosity or a symptom of dissatisfaction with Earth? Colonies on Mars would not erase the climate crises, conflicts, and inequalities here. They might even replicate them in harsher forms. And yet, to deny the pull is impossible. Mars is a gravitational force of the psyche as much as of the cosmos. It calls not because it solves, but because it compels. Religions, too, may transform under its influence. A second world inhabited by humans would stretch creation stories, alter sacred geographies, demand new cosmologies. For some, Mars might become holy ground, proof that life is not confined to Eden. For others, it could be blasphemy, a theft of divine territory. Already, sermons and scriptures have bent to include the red planet, casting it as both warning and promise. Theologies adapt because they must when reality enlarges the stage. Even art will follow, as it always has. Films will dramatize the first steps, novels will embroider the silences between transmissions, painters will attempt to capture the palette of rust and sky. Children will grow up drawing not only blue and green Earth, but red and gold Mars. Their lullabies will include tales of two homes. In this way, Mars ceases to be other. It becomes part of the human household, as familiar as the moon once was to ancestors who painted it on cave walls. Perhaps the final lesson is humility. Mars doesn't answer every question. It resists neat categories, slipping between lifeless and living, familiar and alien, myth and matter. It teaches us that mystery endures even under microscopes, that imagination cannot be separated from observation. To study Mars is to study our own restless need to reach, to narrate, to fill voids with meaning. Whether we find fossils or only dust, whether we raise colonies or only monuments, Mars will remain the theater where humanity rehearses what it means to exist. And so the story circles back to where it began, not with a telescope or a probe, but with a gaze lifted toward the night sky. A red point glows among the stars, steady and patient. We have filled it with fears, painted it with wars, crowned it with gods, and dreamed it as refuge. Now we step closer than ever before, carrying instruments but also myths, data but also longing. Mars does not belong to us, and yet it shapes us. In its silence, it speaks of fragility. In its dust, it whispers of resilience. In its mystery, it keeps us awake, questioning, reaching. The desert of space is vast, but it is not empty. It is full of echoes, waiting for ears that can listen. As long as we dream of Mars, as long as we walk its plains or study its stones, we are not just exploring another planet. We are exploring the boundaries of what it means to be human. And in that endless exploration, every horizon becomes an invitation. Welcome to Historic Sleep.